So back in February of 2020, right? It seems like a long time ago. This is before COVID existed, right? Well, actually, I think it had just come on the scene, if I'm being honest. February 2020, right? Our ministry team went away on a retreat, and we sought God, and we came back and stood before the church, and we shared Isaiah 43 with you, where it talks about, God says through Isaiah, "Behold, I'm doing something new. I'm going to bring streams of living water to the wastelands." We shared that passage with the church because as a ministry team, we just felt convicted by God that he was saying to us that he was about to do something new in our church, that there was something coming that wasn't quite here yet. And as a team, we stood up in faith saying, we think it's happening. Now, at the time, I didn't know that streams of living water might have meant online streams of living water, but that's kind of what happened, a month later. But I stand before you today to say to you that I actually think that what we felt that God was about to do, has already begun in our midst. That we are seeing God move in some profound ways in our church and our community. And whereas back in 2020 we felt like it's coming, I want to say to you today, I feel like it is here. And there are so many things that I see happening around me that just speak as evidence of some of that. And back in 2020, one of the big issues we were facing was going, well, there's no new people coming to our church. We're not seeing new faces. We haven't seen our church grow. And this is before we could point to COVID as a reason for that. Now I look around at our church and I'm seeing so many new faces. In fact, I want to ask some of you to be brave here this morning, right? If you have joined our church or started attending our church sometime after February of 2020, could you be brave for a ticking? Could you just stand up? That's Austral too, because that's all of you at Austral. Who's joined since February 2020? How good is this, huh? I don't know if you guys realize, but you are you can sit down, you are part of an answer to prayer in this church. You are part of what God is doing in this church as he is moving amongst us. And at the end of last year, particularly in that last quarter of 2023, I had so many people come to me saying, Ryan, I can't quite put my finger on it, but God is just up to something in this church at the moment. I can just smell it on this church. People would come to me afterwards and say, I just felt like the Holy Spirit was moving. Or I felt like I heard from God. Or I just felt like God's presence was just resting in our space together as we worshiped. And it was just astounding, conversation after conversation, as people were coming to me. And I don't know if you see it. I don't know if you feel it. I don't know if you notice it. But I want to say in faith this morning that I believe that God is doing something new. That he is bringing streams of living water to our church and to our community and to the world around us. And to me, this is an exciting season to lean into as we see God move amongst us. And so the question I want to pose to you this morning is, how should we respond? If God is doing a work amongst us, if he is doing something new, how do we as a church community respond to what God is up to? You see, for me, as I look ahead at 2024, I actually think this year has more to do with the state of our heart than the state of our hands. Right? Our hands are important, don't get me wrong. The way that we serve God and the things we put our hands to are important, and we are going to talk about those things. But I think the most important thing for us is what happens in our heart. The way that we center our hearts on Jesus as the first and greatest priority in our life. And honestly, I believe that when Jesus is our first and greatest priority, when that starts from the inside out of who we are, everything else starts to work itself out. Everything else finds its place. And I see this in the scriptures. I see this in the teachings of Jesus. And so what I want to do is we're going to open up a passage together this morning. And if you have your Bibles with you, you're welcome to open that up. And if you don't have them, we'll have the Bible here on the screen and you can follow along with us. We're going to be reading from Matthew chapter 22. And to give you some context to this passage, Jesus has been having some debates with the Pharisees and some of the religious leaders of his day. And they are intentionally trying to trick him and trap him. They're trying to incriminate him. And so they send an expert in the law, a lawyer. They send a lawyer to Jesus to ask him this tricky, curly question. And we're going to pick up this passage from where that starts. So we're in chapter 22, verse 34 to 40. This is what it says. When the Pharisees heard that he, Jesus, had silenced the Sadducees with his reply, they met together to question him again. And one of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap him with this question. Right? So here's this expert in the law. He's trying to trap him. And I just want you to understand this. When he's trying to trap him, he's not just trying to publicly humiliate Jesus. You know, he's not just trying to have a laugh and be like, Jesus, you don't know what you're talking about. He's trying to incriminate him. He wants Jesus to say something that he can use to have him executed. That's the level of tension that is in this passage. And so he wants Jesus to, in some ways, maybe say a heresy or say something that puts foot in mouth in that way. So he asks him this question. He says, "Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" Now that's a loaded question because in the law of Moses, in the Old Testament, there's a stack of commandments. There are so many things, and all of them are important. So I think this teacher is wanting Jesus to maybe elevate something ahead of something else in a way that maybe he thinks is not correct. So he's waiting to trap him. But what I love about this passage is that there is now no pause between this question and Jesus' answer. Right? Jesus didn't have to stop and think and ponder this question. He knew straight away which was the most important commandment of them all. And this is what he says. Jesus replied, verse 37, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." And that's where we'll stop. So when asked which is the most important commandment, Jesus says it straight out. He says, actually, the most important thing is to love God. To love God with all of your heart and all of your soul, all of your strength, right? He says, love God with every fiber of your being. That is the most important thing. And then he goes on to say, but actually there is a second thing. The second thing is to love other people, right? But the first is to love God. Now, I think it's interesting that Jesus gives this response because there's probably a whole bunch of things he could have said. Jesus could have said daily prayer is the most important thing. He could have said fasting is the most important thing. He could have said tithes and offerings are the most important thing. Worship at the temple. He could have said memorizing scripture or teaching your children scripture. He could have said any of these things could have been the most important thing. But Jesus gets straight to the core of the issue. He says the most important thing is to love God. Is to love God. Now, when Jesus says this is not a new idea for those that he's speaking to. For the Jewish audience at that time, they were very familiar with this idea because it comes from a passage in Deuteronomy. And I want to read that to you. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 5, and it's called the Shema. And in those days, and still today actually, many Jews, they will pray this passage twice every day. And it says, "Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all of your strength." There's only really one word difference there, strength and mind, between the two ways it's interpreted, but it's the same root idea there. Jesus takes this passage that they were familiar with, this prayer that they were already praying twice per day, and he says, that is the most important thing. If you can do nothing else for God, the most important thing is to love him with every part of who you are. But what does it mean to love God like that? What could it mean for you and I today to love God? Well, for a lot of us, when we hear the idea of loving God, we think about maybe Jesus being our boyfriend. We think about romance or gooey ideas. And this idea of love, sometimes we struggle to grapple with what it could mean for us to love God because we often think about love as an emotion, particularly a romantic emotion. But the context of this Deuteronomy passage that Jesus quotes is a covenant relationship. Now, you're familiar with the idea of a covenant relationship. Marriage is a covenant relationship, right? It's a promise between two people. And so this covenant relationship between God and his people was God promising to be their God and God's people, the Israelites at that time, promising to be God's people. It was a covenant relationship. And in that arrangement, the word love that is used here, it actually is an attitude that is expressed in action, right? It's not an emotion per se. It is an attitude that is expressed in action. Love was a very practical, action-orientated concept when they spoke about this. And the context of this covenant relationship between God and his people, it was all about both parties seeking the well-being and the pleasure of the other. I mean, get that. The God in relationship with you and I would be seeking our well-being and our pleasure. That's the kind of God that we have. That's the kind of God that went to the cross for us, a God who is seeking our well-being and our pleasure. He wants to bring us joy and delight. And in return, he invites us to love him, to take practical actions to bring pleasure and joy back to God. And I love that already this morning we've been talking about that in the way that our worship blesses and brings joy back to God. In communion, as we've spoken about God restoring the joy of our salvation, the joy that he has given us. So love is an attitude expressed in action. And both in this passage in Deuteronomy and when Jesus requotes it, we're commanded to love in these different areas, loving with all of our heart, our soul, and our strength. And I want to take a moment to explain a little bit about what those mean. Because you might hear those words and go, oh, that's just like three ways of saying the same thing. Well, maybe to us it might sound like that. This sounds like there's a lot of overlap, and there is. But the original words and the original emphasis here was actually like a concentric sphere that was just growing and radiating. You see, in the Deuteronomy passage, when it says, love the Lord with all your heart, the word here is lebeb, and it means the inner person. Love God with every part of your inner person. And some words that might describe that could be emotions, will, mind, or heart. These things that go on inside of us was the inner person. So Moses, when he's saying to God's people, he says, love with all of your heart, your inner person. But then he amps it up to the next level because it can't just stop there. He says, love the Lord your God with all of your nefesh, your soul. And that word nefesh, the emphasis is on your entire being, your entire person. You know, it might mean your desires, your life, your whole self. It can mean your body, depending on the context that word is used. So suddenly Moses takes it from being your inner person to a bit more of your outer and holistic person. Love God with all of your heart, all of your soul, your entire being. And then he goes on to say, love God with all of your mahod, your strength. Later on, it gets reinterpreted as your mind. But that word, I found it interesting as I was researching that word in preparation for this message. That word has the emphasis of resources. So love God with all of your mental resources, all of the faculties that you have available to you. But it can also extend to loving God with all of the other resources that you have available. The emphasis was on your power, your physical, emotional, economical, and social strength. Imagine that, loving God with all of your social influence, all of your economic capacity, every sense of power that you have in your life, saying, God, I want to honor you and love you with all of that. You see, Moses, when he brings this commandment to the people, he's leaving no stone unturned. He's basically saying you are to love God with every part of your life, every fiber of your being, and it starts from the inside and it works its way out. You see, through the ages, Christianity in church, people have tried to work it out from the outside in, saying if you just do all these things and get these things right, maybe you'll be okay inside. But the Bible, the Gospels, it teaches us that it starts from the inside out. As we love God with all of our heart, it goes out to our soul, out to our strength, our mind, every facet of our body. Now, today we have a bit of an object lesson, and it's going to be here for the first quarter of the year. Have you seen this stained glass behind me? How cool is this? I have a wonderful wife that has been on her hands and knees creating that this week, and it is a symbol of what we're talking about in this series. And Austral, don't you worry, because we got one of these coming your way next week, and you're going to have one there as well, so everybody gets one. And so what we got here is this symbol of the heart. And in the middle of the heart, we have the cross. And it's symbolic of this idea that we are to have the love for Christ at the center of our heart. And you know what that does? It actually lights up and it radiates every part of our life. And so you'll see all these stained glass compartments. And it's symbolic of the fact that when we love God with all of our heart, that it flows into every part of our being, every compartment of our life, be it the schedule that we have, the activities that we have, the positions that we have, the relationships that we have. Our love for God is to radiate through our entire being. And so as this remains up for the first quarter of this year, I want it to be a visual reminder of what we are striving towards as a church. That we are a church that is desiring above all other things to love God first and to allow our love for God to radiate and to shine through every part of who we are. That's both as individuals and together as a corporate church. So we are to love the Lord with all our heart, all our soul, all our strength. So let me ask you this question. I wonder, what is your attitude towards God? If love is an attitude expressed in action, I wonder, what is your attitude towards God? Is it one of love or obligation or fear? How do you respond to God? I wonder, is your love for God an attitude that is expressed in actions in every sphere of your life? You see, the problem is, and the problem for all of us, is I think we often compartmentalize our love for God. I know I do it. I know many of us struggle with it, that we compartmentalize our love for God. I've just written a list of some of the ways I know I have done this before. Maybe you have too. For some of us, we have an extracurricular love for God where we love God in our spare time and it doesn't interfere with anything else. Sometimes we love God in segmented ways. You know, we can love him first in one area, but not necessarily in another area of our life. Sometimes we have a scheduled love for God. I'll love him at this day and this time, and the rest of my week I'll just kind of get on with it. For some of us, we have a juggled love. We're juggling God as one of many priorities, and he's just an equal thing with all the other things that we're juggling in our life. For some of us, we have a convenience love. We love God when it suits us and suits our need. I mean, maybe you can label some other things in your own life. These are all things that I have wrestled with, and I have struggled with, and I have to repent of. Because I think for all of us as humans, we fall into that trap, don't we? Where we compartmentalize and we put our love for God in just one box in our life. But Jesus reaffirms that the most important thing is to love him with every part of us, from the inside all the way out. So what does that mean for us as a church? Well, as a church, I want to reiterate the fact that I believe that God is doing something new amongst us. He just seems to be on the move. He just seems to be drawing people here. He just seems to be causing some of our ministries to become more fruitful than they have been before. And I love just watching God at work. Sometimes I just scratch my head and go, wow, I didn't know God was going to do that. So how do we respond to a God who is on the move in our life? I believe that the only response that we can have is to keep rededicating ourselves to him. To keep coming back before him year after year and saying, God, I want to love you with all of my being. I want you to be the first and most important part of my life because that is how I respond to the God who is on the move. I believe that the only appropriate response is to rededicate. Now, what does that word rededicate mean? Well, for some of us here, we have made a faith commitment. We've said, you know what? I'm going to follow Jesus. And over the years, for one reason or another, maybe we become tired, we carry some wounds, we get busy, God gets mixed into all the other parts of our life. Well, to rededicate is to come back again and say, you know what? I've already said that I want God to be the top priority, but I'm going to reaffirm that commitment. Because once again, I want to say that Jesus is Lord above everything else in my life. And so maybe you're sitting here this morning and you're saying, well, I've been following Jesus for my entire life or for decades of my life. And this morning, the invitation is to once again rededicate. To rededicate the year that is before us and say, Jesus, I want to love you more this year than I have in any other year of my life. Like, what a vision for our life that could be this year, that we could get to the end of this year and look back on 2024 and say, that year, I loved God more than I ever have before. And as a church, that would be the vision that I have for us this year, is that we would together love God more than we ever have before. And I tell you what, that's a high benchmark to set, because this is the kind of church that loves God, that has served God faithfully for so many years. And so I want to keep going. I want to keep going deeper and further in that. You know, when people come to this church, they may not agree with everything that we believe. They may not like the way that we do things, but I want it to be undeniable when they walk in these doors that these people love God. When people come into the hub pantry during the week to get food and assistance, even if they don't know what we believe, I want them to be like, there is something crazy about these people because they're radiating something and I don't know where it comes from. That's the love of God radiating through us on mission in this community. My hope, my desire, my vision, my picture that I feel like God is giving us for church this year is that we would be a church that is lit up like that stained glass, that we would be on fire with love in our hearts and in every part of our life for Jesus and what he is doing amongst us. Because to me, that is the only way that we can appropriately respond to what God is doing. It's the only way we can respond. Now, hopefully by now, you've seen the challenge. Maybe you've noticed the challenge with what I'm talking about here this morning. Let me call it out. The challenge is that what I'm asking of you is pretty well impossible for each of us. As much as we really want to love God, we fall and we fail and other things take priority. We turn towards sin. We turn into apathy, whatever it might be for you and I want to be the first to say, that's me too. For all of us, we desire to love God, but we struggle to do so. And you know, for me, as I look back at the last 12 or 18 months of my life, if I was just taking stock of my own heart and my own life, just being real with you, I think in so many ways my love for God has been tempered in this season. I think maybe my love for God is probably sat at like 60, maybe 70% in the season behind us. And I know exactly why that be. I faced some hard times. I have had challenges in every sphere of my life. There's been pain and struggle and difficulty. And I think at times I have allowed those challenges to temper my love for God. That at times my love for God has been more pragmatic than passionate. You know, I go, I should spend some time with God because it's a good thing to do, not because I'm out of the wellspring of my heart desiring to be at the feet of Jesus. And it's a trap, particularly for someone who works in ministry, to fall into just being practical with Jesus rather than actually living out of that passion. And so I want to own that before you this morning and say, you know what? I don't want that to be my heart in 2024. I want to be 150% in. Right? I want to be radiant for Jesus. I want to be completely abandoned for him. And so I want to choose as we start this year and as we look ahead to say, Jesus, would you help me do that? Because I know by my own strength, I'm going to get tired, I'm going to get wounded, I'm going to face challenges. I can't do that by myself. But Jesus can help me do that. It's the never-ending irony of the gospel, right? That we actually need God's help to love him in response to what he's done. And it's a beautiful irony that we can't do it without his help. And so I want to be asking God to help me to love him more. For in my life this year to be the next level, the most that I've ever loved him before. And I'm wondering if you will come on this journey with me. If maybe for you, you might be able to look into your own heart and your own life and say, where have I grown tired? Where have I turned away from God? Where have I been tempered? How can I surrender that to him and invite the work of the Holy Spirit to draw those things out and to grow in me a love for God? Not just a gooey emotion, but an attitude that is expressed in action in every sphere of my life. And so today, as we rededicate, it's actually about asking for God's help. So asking for his help to transform us, to grow us, and stretch us so that this year we could love him with all of our heart, all of our soul, and all of our strength. And so I wonder if you will come on this journey with me. If today in your own heart and your own mind, you'll draw a line in the sand and say, you know what, as of today, I want to love God more. I want to invite him in. And maybe for some of you, it's going to be the first time you've ever made that decision to say, Jesus, come on in and be front and center. And for others of you like me, you've been following him for years. And this is an opportunity to say, fresh for 2024, I am all in, Jesus, 150%. So let's declare our love for him. Let's ask for his help. And let's move ahead into 2024 as a church community that is lit up and passionate about loving God. And there's a few practical ways I believe that we can do that, and that we can be doing that together over the month of February. And the first is going to be a month of prayer. I want to invite you to make prayer a priority this month, to set time aside in your own space, your own world, to be praying and to be asking for God's help. We're going to find some opportunities this month to invite you to come and gather with us for prayer. Let's make this a month of prayer, of asking for God's help. Because this isn't just for us at an individual level, this is corporate. I mean, we're going on a journey of changing our church name. We need to be praying and asking for God to reveal that. We're preparing to launch a new campus in Austria. We need to be asking and praying for God's help and God's provision over that. Let February be a month of prayer. But I also want to invite you into a challenge, that February be a month of fasting. Now, for some of the ladies here, they have already begun a sugar fast that they're doing this month. I'm so proud of the women in our church that are doing that. And what I want to do is I want to invite the rest of our church, men, women, young and old, everyone in between, to consider fasting with us this month. Because fasting, it's actually an outward action that we can take that reminds us of that inward commitment that we've made. And so for me, I've already begun fasting this month. I started on the 1st of February. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that you could fast. And some examples could be you might go without sugar, like what the women are doing. Maybe you might choose to drink only water this month and no other liquid beverage. For some people, they might want to just choose to eat fruits and vegetables, like the Daniel fast. For other people, you might want to miss a meal, whatever it might be. For me, I've made the decision that for the month of February, I'm going to have no sugar, I'm going to have no caffeine, I'm going to have no alcohol. 3 things that I enjoy as treats in my life, but I'm not going to have those things. And by far, the caffeine's probably going to be the hardest one. Let's be honest, with 3 kids. But you know, when I give those things up, and when part of me goes, I want those things, what I say in my heart of hearts already is say, but I love God more. You know, I want those things, but I love God more. It's an outward action I can take that reminds me of that inner commitment that I'm making. And maybe this month, you would be courageous enough to join us in fasting and choosing to give something up to remind yourself of the commitment that we are making today, that we want to love God with all of our being. Maybe you can fast for his help to say, Jesus, would you help me this month to love you more? Maybe you can be fasting as we discern a new church name, seeking God for our new identity. Maybe you can be fasting as we launch our ministry areas and be praying for all the things that we are doing as a church. And maybe you can be fasting for breakthrough, for something that you want to see God do in your life this year. You see, church, I know this is a challenge, and some of you go, I don't want to do that. That's too hard. But there is a way that all of us can participate, and I'm inviting you to the challenge to love God. And one way that we could action that is to fast together this month. So this afternoon when I email you, I'm going to send you some ways that you can fast, and I'm going to invite your fast to begin from tomorrow. And there's no pressure. I'm not taking lists of names to know who is fasting. This is between you and God, but I'm inviting you to join us as of tomorrow for the month of February. And on the first Sunday of March, we're going to break that with a family feast like no other, all right? So this is going to be a month of prayer and fasting, but I also want it to be a month of worship. You see, worship resets something in our soul when we fix our attention on God. It actually takes our eyes off the things that are happening around us, and it reminds us who is in charge, who is sovereign, who has the power in our life. And so in a minute, we're going to worship together, but maybe this month you can make a point of playing worship music in the background. Maybe you can have it when you're cooking dinner at home, or when you're driving in the car, or when you're walking to work, or whatever it might be. May this be a month of prayer and of fasting and of worship as we choose to seek God, and together we rededicate ourselves to say we want to be a church that loves God from the inside out. Because I believe, honestly, that if we're not doing that, then nothing else we do really matters. I mean, Paul says, it talks about how if we don't have love, we're like a clashing cymbal and a gong. And I know he's talking about the way that we love each other, but I think the same is true in our love for God. If we're busy serving him, but we don't have a love for him, what does it really matter? But if we love him first, and if that radiates through everything else, man, the gospel testimony just increases in every part of our life. And so, church, I'm inviting you into a big year, into a big vision. But I believe God has called us to love him as our first love and as our greatest priority. And so as a symbol of that, I want to do something special now. And I'm just going to invite Tammy and Guy. They're going to help me just reset this space. We're going to go into a time of worship. And what I would like to do is I'm going to lead you myself in that time of worship. For me, worship is something that I have always been passionate about, something that I love. And this morning, I want to lead you in worship because I want to be the first to say that I want to rededicate my heart back to God. I want to be the first to say that I want this to be a year where I love God with every fiber of my being. And so I've opted this morning to stand up here myself and to lead you, to dust off my guitar and to do that. And so as we do this, I'm going to invite you to stand and to worship with us. And may it just be that this is a moment to redeclare to God that he is our first love, our first priority. So let's declare that symbolically in worship. Why don't you stand? I'm going to pray. I'm going to praise our God.